So what can you tell us about Derrida?
Jacques Derrida. Well, I'm familiar with Jacques Derrida, both as a man and as a soul. Actually, the best, most striking contemporary metaphor for Jacques Derrida is that he is the Batman of modern philosophy.
If he was to have a bat symbol, what would it be?
Well, in many ways, one might say that his emblem might be, for lack of a better term, a black field with a yellow spooge symbol for dissemination. Because he truly tried to disseminate across the entire world, not just the ideas, but the idea itself. You see, what Derrida was, he was like Batman. He was a self-made man that was made by others. Yea, though he was called Jacques Derrida, but that was only by us, only by him. But he was named at birth Jackie. So you could say that Jacques Derrida was the Bruce Wayne that's what he portrayed to the world, the millionaire playboy of intellectual philosophy, where the dark heart, that brooding interior that he had to wrestle with through his entire life, was Jackie Derrida, what he was given, what he was made. That was his internal turmoil. So he was always fighting against that core, the Jacques versus the Jackie. You want to talk about Derrida?
No. Bye, Nick.
One's first encounter with Derrida really has to begin with Saussure, I think. If you look at the definition of language according to Saussure, which is essentially a system of differences without positive terms, then you can begin to grasp what Derrida is talking about in his seminal 1965 lecture that he delivered at Johns Hopkins University, Structure, Sign and Play, and the Discourse of the Human Sciences. In particular, you have to deal with the center is not the center. He goes on to say, as always, coherence and contradiction represents the very force of a desire. So, we mean, and we make meaning, in terms that are negative. We know ourselves only by what we are not. And if you extend that further to one of Derrida's critical buds, Paul de Man, who would say that the only thing literary language really has to teach us is how to read. That each text is really an allegory of reading. And that ultimately, the pedagogy inscribed within this system of language is simply awakening yourself to the knowledge that learning how to read is an impossibility with which we are constantly struggling. That, to me, is a very powerful and seductive dream.
You've brought up some interesting points and talked a little bit about the center. Would you please define what the center is for us?
Certainly.
Or give us an example?
Certainly. The center is not the center. A perfect example of a transcendental signified would, of course, be God. Another one would be perhaps the gold standard, which I believe Richard Nixon took this country off of in the early 70s, much to the chagrin of our present economic crisis.
So you're talking about you use God, you use the gold standard as examples of the transcendental signifier?
Yes, I do.
I think it's a bit simplistic to talk about it in terms of God.
How so, John?
Well, let me start. I have an issue with one of your earlier points.
Okay.
That deconstruction begins with Saussure. I think it does not begin with Saussure. It begins. You have to go all the way back to Plato.
I'd say Socrates even.
Socrates, Plato. Well, Plato, talk about the idea of forms and how this is matter, and these are just, we are reaching toward a higher transcendental understanding of something. And then you see that further manifest in texts like the scriptures, the book of John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. What you see in that text, there's the dream of something sublime, of something transcendental, but you can't escape the inevitability of materialism in that.
So you're just
it's a materialistic philosophy. The Word is material.
Are you saying it's a phenomenology of what? Of its own?
Of its own language. Language is its own phenomenology.
So you're saying language is inherently referential?
Yes, it is.
How do we get outside?
It references itself ultimately, and I think this goes back to your claim about Damon and the allegories of reading, because ultimately the text can reference nothing other than itself if it teaches us how to read.
One of the topics that Derrida discusses is the difference between writing and speaking. And in particular, his book of grammatology delineates the relationship between speaking and writing. In that particular book, he talks about logocentrism, which is the privileging that most ancient philosophers gave to speaking. The notion of logos is a Greek word that stands for thought, speech, law, and so you can see from that definition that speech is privileged because supposedly it was closer to being the truth, in part because the speaker was actually present and his presence in front of his listeners or audience lended itself to creating a truth that writing, because the writer was absent from his audience, didn't have. Well, in grammatology, Derrida supposes that writing and speaking are really the same. It's the distance between the truth, the signifier and the signified is exactly the same. Both the writer and the speaker are dealing with signs. They're talking about something that they're representing to a listener or to a reader, and so hence speaking and writing are basically the same. In fact, to Derrida, unlike Saussure, there is no way of getting to the actual essence or truth of something. We're all speaking of signifiers and signs, and everything is a sign of a sign rather than being a sign of something that is true.
Center, other. What?
Sit down, Evie. Center, 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 center,
I got to pick Evie.
center, center, other.